I never thought I'd have to fight for land that already belonged to me. But Karen decided that it is time to make my life more complicated, steal my land, and build her own house on it. Before we dive into this intense story, we have a small favor to ask. Drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. It's always incredible to see how far our stories reach. Thank you so much. Now let's dive in. When my uncle, George Lawson, passed away last year, I inherited his 15-acre property just outside of Willow Creek. It wasn't a massive estate or a large farm, just a quiet piece of land with a small family cabin, an old workshop, and the woods my uncle cherished. Uncle George had lived there alone for years, ever since my aunt passed. He never remarried. Instead, he poured his time into the land, keeping the place in shape, fixing up the fences, and making sure every piece of it stayed just as it had been when his father had owned it before him. One day, he told me when I visited a year before he died, they'll try to take this from you. Don't let them. At the time, I had laughed. Who the hell would try to steal it? Uncle George was a little paranoid, always grumbling about the HOA that had swallowed up half of Willow Creek over the past 2 decades. The houses had spread slowly, inch by inch, year by year, until the once rural town had turned into another copy-paste suburban development. But they'd never touched his land. They couldn't. He refused to sell, refused to be bullied, refused to let them pave over his family's history. And now he was gone. And his warning? It was right. For the past year, I had been back and forth between my home in the city and Uncle George's property, keeping it in my name but never having the time to settle there permanently. The place needed work, repairs, updates, fresh paint, but I wasn't in a rush. I figured I had time. I was wrong. That morning, my phone rang at exactly 6:17 a.m. It was Mr. Bennett, the old rancher who lived just down the road. "You planning on selling that land, son?" he asked without preamble. I frowned, still groggy from sleep. "What? No. Why would you ask that?" Bennett was silent for a second, then exhaled sharply through the phone. "Then you need to get out here, now." I sat up instantly. "What's going on?" Another pause. Then, with something like disgust in his voice, he said, "They're building on it." I broke every speed limit getting to Willow Creek. The drive, normally peaceful, felt like it stretched forever. And then, when I turned onto the familiar dirt road leading to Uncle George's cabin, my heart dropped. The first thing I saw was the sign. A brand new HOA signpost hammered into the ground near the driveway. "Future home of the Wilkes residents, a Willow Creek HOA community property." I slammed on the brakes. Karen Wilkes, the HOA president, the woman who had spent years trying to force Uncle George into selling. I threw the truck into park and jumped out, my boots crunching on gravel as I stormed toward the property. The sight in front of me made my blood boil. The cabin was still there, but just beyond it, where the open clearing used to be, stood the wooden frame of a house under construction, the skeleton of a home. My land. A partially built 2-story structure, its framework exposed like an open wound. Stacks of lumber lay on pallets. Concrete foundation slabs were drying in the sun. There were workers everywhere, some hauling materials, others hammering beams into place, moving as if they had every right to be there. I strode forward, my pulse pounding in my ears. "Hey!" I called out. One of the workers, a man in his 40s, turned to look at me. He frowned. "Can I help you?" I stepped closer. "Yeah, you can start by telling me who the hell gave you permission to build on my land." Before the worker could answer, I heard the sharp click of heels on gravel behind me. That would be me. I turned around and came face to face with Karen Wilkes. She stood there, dressed in pressed beige slacks and a pale blue blouse, her blonde hair styled into its usual helmet-like perfection. Her face was all polite confidence, as if she was about to sell me a timeshare, not explain why she was building on land she didn't own. I took a slow, measured breath. "Karen," I said, my voice cold, "why the hell is there a house being built on my land?" She sighed dramatically, as if she had been expecting this conversation. "Listen, dear," she said, tilting her head slightly. "I know this must be overwhelming for you." I clenched my jaw. "Don't talk to me like I'm an idiot. Explain now." Karen smiled. that infuriating HOA smile, and clasped her hands in front of her. "You weren't using the land," she said simply. "It was just sitting here, unattended, collecting weeds. A waste, really. So, the HOA made an executive decision." "An executive decision?" I repeated, my voice low. She nodded, as if this was completely normal. "My son and his wife needed a new home," she continued, "and the community board agreed that this was a much better use of the space." I stared at her. "A better use of the space?" Karen smiled again, wider this time. "Yes, I mean, honestly," she gestured around dramatically, "this land was just sitting here doing nothing. No development, no maintenance, no real purpose. We assumed you were just going to let it rot away." I took a step closer, forcing myself to stay calm. "Karen," I said slowly, "you don't get to make those decisions about land you don't own." Her smile didn't waver. "Well," she said, "about that." She reached into her folder and pulled out a printed document. I grabbed it. At the top, in bold letters, it read, "Property Abandonment and Transfer, Willow Creek HOA." I felt my stomach turn. Karen tilted her head. "You see, your uncle's property was recorded as abandoned in the HOA's official registry, and according to local ordinances, land that remains unclaimed or unused for over a year can be reclaimed for community purposes." I gripped the paper tighter. "That's a lie." She waved a hand. "Technicalities." I felt rage boiling under my skin. "You knew I inherited this land. You knew I had ownership. And you went behind my back and filed this anyway." Karen didn't deny it. Instead, she smiled. "I did what was best for the community," she said simply. "You'll come to see that in time." I exhaled slowly. "Karen." "Yes, dear." I stepped even closer. "I'm going to burn your whole effing HOA to the ground." Karen's smug expression flickered for just a second, just long enough for me to know I'd rattled her. But then, like clockwork, she recovered, shifting back into her usual calculated confidence. "Well," she said, letting out a soft chuckle, "I'm afraid that's just not how things work around here. You see, the HOA operates under strict guidelines, and all property adjustments are handled in accordance with—" I took a step closer, cutting her off. "I don't give a damn about your HOA guidelines, Karen." The workers nearby stopped what they were doing, sensing the tension. The whole site went silent. I held up the paper, the fraudulent document she had just handed me, and ripped it clean in half. Karen's eyes narrowed. "That wasn't necessary," she said, her voice clipped. "Oh, it was," I shot back, "because this is my land, and I don't care what your fake paperwork says, I never abandoned it. I have the deed, the will, and legal ownership." Karen's mouth opened slightly as if to argue, but I wasn't finished. "And I'll tell you what's about to happen," I continued. "You're going to stop construction. You're going to tell your son and his wife to find somewhere else to live. And then you're going to pray I don't sue you into the ground." Her jaw tightened. Then, slowly, her smile returned. But this time it wasn't friendly. It was sharp, calculated. "Oh, sweetheart," she said, voice dripping with mock pity. "You really don't know how things work in Willow Creek, do you?" I could feel my fists clenching. She took a step closer, lowering her voice just enough that only I could hear. "You think you can just march in here and throw threats around?" she whispered. "I run this town, the HOA. It's not just a committee, it's a system, a network. The county clerk, my husband's golf partner, the zoning officer. Her sister-in-law is on my board." She smiled wider. "I have real power here. You're just an outsider who inherited some old dirt." I exhaled slowly, staring at her. "You know," I said, matching her tone, "I had a feeling you were going to say something like that." Karen blinked. I pulled my phone from my pocket, turned the screen toward her, and hit play. Her own voice rang out clearly. "The HOA made an executive decision. My son and his wife needed a new home, and we decided this was a much better use of the space." Karen went pale. I smiled. "You were saying?" I didn't waste another second. That same afternoon, I walked into the office of Walter Green, a seasoned property lawyer in Willow Creek, and dumped everything onto his desk: the deed, the will, the fraudulent HOA documents, and the recording of Karen's confession. Walter skimmed through the papers, then slowly removed his glasses. "This," he said, shaking his head, is one of the worst HOA land grabs I've ever seen. I leaned forward. Can we shut them down? Walter smirked. Not only can we shut them down, he said, but if this goes to trial, Karen's entire HOA could be dismantled. I grinned. Then let's bury them. Within 24 hours, Walter had filed a lawsuit against the HOA and Karen Wilkes personally. Fraudulent property claims, illegal construction on private land, criminal trespassing, attempted theft of land. And just for good measure, we sent a cease and desist order to Karen's son, forcing them to halt construction immediately. The morning after the lawsuit was filed, I returned to the property. Sure enough, the construction had stopped. The workers were gone. The equipment was abandoned. But as I pulled up the driveway, I spotted Karen standing at the edge of the property. Her arms crossed so tightly her knuckles were white. The second I stepped out of my truck, she marched toward me. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" she snapped. I smirked. "Taking back what's mine," I said simply. Karen was fuming. "You cannot do this," she seethed. "You don't have the right." I pulled the cease and desist order from my pocket and tossed it onto the ground at her feet. She stared at it, her face turning redder by the second. "You think this is over?" she spat. "You have no idea who you're messing with." I chuckled, crossing my arms. "Funny," I said. "I was about to say the same thing to you." Then I turned and walked away, leaving her seething in the dust. The lawsuit was bad enough for Karen, but she wasn't done making stupid choices. That night, at exactly 2:41 a.m., my security cameras caught her sneaking onto my land. She wasn't alone. She had brought 2 men with her, and together they tried to move building materials back onto the site. She thought I wouldn't catch her. She thought wrong, because when I pulled into the driveway the next morning, 2 police officers were already waiting. One of them nodded toward me. "You the property owner?" I grinned. "That's me." Karen stood off to the side, looking furious and disheveled, her usual perfect hair a mess, her clothes wrinkled, and her face filled with panic. The officer held up his notepad. "Looks like she and her guys tried to restart construction on your land," he said, "which, given the lawsuit, is considered criminal trespassing." He turned to Karen. "Miss Wilkes, you're under arrest." Karen's face twisted in rage. "You can't do this!" she shrieked. "I'm the HOA president." The officer sighed. "Yeah, well, you might want to tell that to the judge." He snapped the cuffs onto her wrists. Karen started screaming. "This is his fault," she wailed. "He's lying! He's a fraud!" The officers ignored her. I leaned against my truck, arms crossed, watching as they shoved her into the police car. Just before they closed the door, she turned toward me, her face filled with pure hatred. "You think you've won?" she spat. I smiled. "No, Karen," I said. "I know I have. But this wasn't over. Karen was just the beginning. The HOA was still standing, and if I wanted to protect my land for good, I needed to burn it to the ground. I wasn't just taking my property back. I was going to end the HOA's corruption for good. I pulled out my phone and made a call. "Hey, Walter, we're not stopping at Karen." A pause. "You ready to take down the entire HOA?" Walter chuckled. "Let's do it." Karen's arrest was only the first step. If I wanted to make sure this never happened again, I had to take down the HOA completely. I wasn't just playing defense anymore. I was going to burn their entire operation to the ground. After Karen's arrest, I sat down with my lawyer, Walter Green, to plan our next move. "Taking down an HOA isn't easy," he said, leaning back in his chair. "They have lawyers, connections, and money. But if we can prove corruption, embezzlement, illegal activities," he grinned, "then we can bury them." I smirked. "Then let's start digging." Walter started filing legal motions while I focused on talking to the people Karen had screwed over. And the deeper I dug, the worse it got. Homeowners were fined for ridiculous reasons. One man had been fined $300 for painting his front door the wrong shade of blue. An elderly couple had been forced to sell their home because the HOA claimed their lawn was unkept. Families were pressured into selling so Karen and her board could flip the homes for profit. HOA fees had mysteriously doubled over the last 3 years, but no one knew where the money was going. And then I found the smoking gun. Walter had subpoenaed the HOA's financial records, and what we found, pure fraud. Karen and her board had been embezzling HOA funds for years. Over $500,000 in homeowner dues had been funneled into consulting fees, which were actually fake companies owned by Karen's family members. New roads? Never built. Community park renovations? Never happened. Security upgrades? All fake. Karen and her cronies had been stealing money for years, and no one had noticed. Until now. With the evidence in hand, I called for a public HOA meeting. Karen's board members, clearly shaken from her arrest, tried to cancel it. They sent out emails claiming it was unauthorized. They removed notices from bulletin boards. They even had their lapdog attorney threaten legal action. So, I rented the Willow Creek Community Hall myself and spread the word. Flyers were handed out at every doorstep. Local businesses displayed notices in their windows. Facebook groups exploded with messages. By the time the night of the meeting arrived, it wasn't just a gathering of frustrated homeowners, it was a storm brewing. Over 200 homeowners filled the hall, standing shoulder to shoulder, buzzing with uncertainty, anger, and anticipation. People muttered to each other, asking the same question, "What's going on? What's this about? Did the HOA really steal from us?" At the front, the remaining HOA board members sat at their long table, nervous, rigid, and clearly uncomfortable. Without Karen there to control the room, they looked like cornered animals. Some of them fidgeted, avoiding eye contact. Others whispered frantically among themselves. One, Mr. Lewis, the treasurer, wiped the sweat from his balding head with a trembling hand. They knew what was coming. And then, I stepped onto the stage. The hall fell silent. I looked across the sea of homeowners, took a deep breath, and said, "You've all been lied to." Murmurs spread through the crowd. For years, the Willow Creek HOA has been running a scam. You were told your fees were going toward improving the community, road repairs, security upgrades, landscaping. But instead, I clicked the first slide on the projector. A spreadsheet of the HOA's finances flashed across the giant screen. Over the last 5 years, more than $500,000 of your money disappeared, and I can prove exactly where it went. A collective gasp rippled through the audience. I clicked again. A list of payments filled the screen. Large sums of money paid to fake companies owned by Karen's family members and her closest board allies. The crowd erupted. "What? That's our money! They stole from us!" The HOA board members flinched as the angry shouts grew louder. I turned to the board. "Would anyone here like to explain?" They said nothing. Dead silence. Until Mr. Lewis, the treasurer, suddenly stood up. I didn't know," he stammered, voice shaking. "Karen handled all the finances. She made me sign things I didn't even look at." Someone from the crowd shouted. "So you just let her steal from us?" Lewis panicked. "She told me it was all legal, that the expenses were approved. I didn't think to question it." I folded my arms. "But you signed off on the fake invoices, didn't you?" His face turned pale. I didn't mean—" The crowd was turning on him fast. Someone threw a crumpled program at him from the back. A woman in the front row, tears in her eyes, yelled, "You took our savings. We trusted you." Lewis looked ready to bolt. But before he could, another HOA board member, Ms. Hartley, the secretary, stood up. "I didn't know about the missing money," Hartley said, voice shaking. "But I did know about the forced sales." Gasps. Dead silence. I turned to her. "You're admitting Karen forced people to sell their homes?" She nodded miserably. "She had a system," Hartley muttered. "She'd target homeowners who couldn't fight back, people behind on HOA fees, elderly folks, families going through rough times." I clenched my fists. "And what did she do?" "She'd hit them with fines," she whispered. "Hundreds, sometimes thousands of dollars. They'd get overwhelmed, fall behind, and eventually they'd be forced to sell." People in the audience started sobbing. One man stood up, voice filled with rage. "Karen forced me to sell my father's house. He built that house with his own hands. She called it an eyesore. Made me sell it to the HOA for half its worth." His hands trembled. "And now she's using it as a rental." The anger in the room boiled over. People jumped from their seats, shouting, "They stole from us! She took my neighbor's house! We need to call the cops!" The HOA board members looked ready to run, and then the doors burst open. Karen stormed in, flanked by 2 lawyers, her face twisted with fury. She pointed a shaking finger at me. You set this up!" she shrieked. I smiled. "Oh, Karen, you did this to yourself!" Before she could respond, the sheriff stepped in behind her. "Karen Wilkes!" he said loudly. Karen froze. She turned, stiff as a board. "We have a warrant for your arrest," the sheriff continued. "Fraud, racketeering, illegal property acquisition. Please put your hands behind your back." The room exploded. People cheered. Karen screamed, "This is a mistake! I'm the HOA president! You can't do this to me!" She thrashed as the deputies grabbed her, snapping handcuffs onto her wrists. Her own board members backed away, leaving her completely alone. As she was dragged toward the exit, her eyes locked onto mine. "You think this is over?" she spat. I smirked. "Karen, this was over the moment you stole from the wrong person." The deputies hauled her outside. As the door slammed shut behind her, the room erupted into cheers. The HOA was finished. Karen was sentenced to 10 years in prison for fraud, racketeering, and illegal property acquisitions. Her entire HOA board was removed and forced to pay back every stolen dollar. The HOA was dissolved permanently. The stolen homes were returned to their rightful owners. The unfair fines were refunded. And the community? It finally belonged to the people again. I kept my land, untouched as it should be. And as I stood on my property, watching the bulldozers tear down Karen's half-built house, I finally understood what Uncle George had meant. "One day, they'll try to take what's yours. Don't let them," I smiled. I never had. Within a month, Walter had filed a class-action lawsuit against the HOA. We sued them for property fraud, illegal fines, financial mismanagement. Racketeering homeowners lined up to join the case. By the time the trial began, the HOA had lost all support. Karen's former allies turned on her, exposing even more corruption. When the judge saw the evidence, his decision was brutal. The HOA was dissolved, permanently. Every homeowner was refunded their stolen fees. Karen and the board members were ordered to pay back every stolen dollar. Karen personally faced felony charges for fraud. Her property was seized, her assets were frozen, and her power was gone. Karen Wilkes, the queen of the HOA, was now bankrupt, disgraced, and facing jail time. With the HOA gone, Willow Creek was finally free. Fines were abolished. Unfair home restrictions were lifted. Homeowners finally got control over their own properties. I kept my land, and Karen's half-built house, I had it bulldozed. I built a community garden there instead, a place where neighbors could gather, free from HOA tyranny. As I stood on my land, watching families plant flowers where Karen's fraud had once stood, I finally felt it. Justice. Uncle George was right. One day, they'll try to take what's yours. Don't let them. And I never did. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, comment, and share your thoughts below. Your support helps bring more stories like this to life.